Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The nation has been riveted by the standoff between the U.S. and Iran. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The latest events saw the killing of Qasem Soleimani and the missile counterstrike against the military bases in Iraq. This conflict may not simply be political or military, but also cultural. We have in our studio this morning Dr. Jacques Koko. He's associate professor in the Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution Department at Salisbury University. Also, author of a new book entitled Mindful of Cultures and Conflicts. And welcome to the program.
Thank you, Don, for having me.
So, how do you read this this conflict that we're now seeing being played out in terms of Iran and the United States, particularly from a cultural point of view? We've been stressing the politics of it, what the Iranians may want and not want in terms of material influence abroad, and I suppose the United States' interests. How do you see this conflict?
I think you're right. What's happening is not only political, but also cultural. And we can look at all that from a very cultural perspective. See, Iran is a theocratic, regime. We are an Islamic country, Islamic Republic. So whatever is happening there is it's dictated by God, from their perspective. And when you go ahead and you kill a general, it's a major crime. They can't accept that, Imagine, us killing Moses, or Joshua. Moses and Joshua, the kind of figures they represent in Judaism, it's a powerful figure, right? It's pretty much the same thing, with Iran. When we go and we kill Soleimani, he's like, a hero. He's like God chosen, which is why we saw all the Iranian gather to support, whatever their regime was to decide against that killing. So that's pretty much cultural, regardless of their differences. When it comes to killing one of their generals, they feel like their culture, is under attack. And we saw that on the streets, all the demonstrations and so on.
We we look at this as the gathering of support for him in a nationalist point of view, that is looking at Iran as a national figure, and therefore that we might look at, for instance, if there was a killing, for instance, of a U.S. official. But you seem to indicate that this goes beyond simply a nationalist sentiment.
Very well. That's right. Soleimani was like a symbolic figure. He reflected a culture. And we are in a culture where pride matters. They like to take pride. So the symbol he represented was a very important symbol for the culture of Iran. And they could not accept us killing him without reacting. And Iran's reaction was pretty much to save face. Face saving is another aspect of their culture. The leaders, they wanted to do something to show their people that, okay, they responded. Regardless of what they did, they needed to respond.
It does seem, though, that the response was hardly as dramatic as the act that precipitated it.
Again, like I said, it's because of the notion of face saving. Think of it. Iran and the U.S., we have the most powerful military on earth. So Iran knows that they cannot engage in a conflict with us and win. But they needed to do something to satisfy the needs of their people. All the people that went on the streets to demonstrate in support for Soleimani, they were like, you know what? We need revenge. The regime in Iran is aware that they cannot engage in a war with the U.S. and win. So what they did is to just console their people with strike without doing any damage. But at the same time, this also reflects the goodwill of the Iranian people. If Iran wanted to kill our soldiers, they'll have done it. I mean, the missile they launched were like sophisticated precision missiles. And they selected not to kill us, pretty much. And that will happen.
So, how do you see this in terms of how the United States looks at this killing, the decision to go ahead and kill him, and this reference back to certainly to the Iraq conflict, the insurgency that took place in the first decade of the thousands? How do you see this being seen from Washington?
Pretty much, our leaders in Washington, they're all product of their culture. We are all product of our culture. Every human being is a product of their culture. So looking at history, they're trying to justify, their actions, what they're doing, and so on. And when you read, what they're doing, they try to fit in a pattern, the Western pattern. We want to win. We want to win, and we need to do everything we can do to win. We can't blame them. Like I said, they are product of their culture.
I mean, is there an underlying sense about how we view the world that pushes us in a particular direction? I mean, I can imagine, for instance, that there might be down the road, folks will be talking about if the U.S. withdraws from Iraq, that then the question will be who lost Iraq?
Well, indeed, we see the world from our worldview. The U.S. believe that, we are a superpower. We are above everybody. We dictate our laws and rules to everybody, and they will accept. But we need to be very careful in how we do it, because the people we are dictating our rules, our laws to, they also have their cultures. Name them Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. And the kind of democracy, for instance, that we want to spread around, how to make sure that it fits in their culture. Think of it, democracy is different depending on the country that you are in, including in the Western countries. Democracy in France is different from what it is in the US. And democracy in the US is different from what it is in India. Democracy in India is different from what it is in Senegal. And they're all democracies. So cultural dynamics affect, political regime. Which is why when we want to dictate democracy or spread democracy to Iraq, we don't understand why Iraqis resist our democracy. Simply because of their culture. Their culture tolerates certain patterns of democracy and reject others. And we want to be very careful, when we are involved in policy making, in analyzing all those cultural dynamics to know how to fit in without imposing our ways of life to others.
So, in fact, turning to Iraq, which was really an instance of nation building, even though that's not what they had planned when they invaded, how do you assess what went wrong in terms of how the Bush folks saw Iraq? I mean, I remember, for instance, Bush's, I think it was his second inaugural address, talking about spreading democracy across the Middle East, so that if you got democracy here, then you get democracy in other places. Where do you think they went wrong here?
Pretty much what happened in Iraq was the fact that we were looking at them as evil and we are good. The dynamic of us versus them, which depict us as good and them as evil. No, they're not evil. And we're not only good. Every human being possesses within it, him or her, goods and bad. We all have our strengths, but also our limitations, regardless of who we are. There are Iraqi people that are wonderful people. And there are US people that are wonderful people. There are some Iraqi leaders that are great people. And some of our leaders are great people as well. But each of us, whether we are in a position of leadership or not, in addition to our qualities, we have our weaknesses. Now, the Bush administration, did amazing thing. But one, in my opinion, of the problem they had was that dichotomy of depicting Iraqis or the Iraq regime as evil and us as, good people. And that's, I know it's from Samuel Huntington, Clashes of Civilization, where he tried to, like, divide the world civilization into 9 civilizations, and, including, the Islamic civilization, the Western civilization. They really used Samuel Huntington to feed that war in Iraq. And that was, in my opinion, not the best approach.
So, in terms of U.S. and how it views the world, one of the things that seems to be the basis for U.S. foreign policy in general, and also how we see ourselves, is what we call American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. We see ourselves certainly breaking away from the old world, which was Europe, and creating something new, so that when we rolled in, for instance, at the end of, the Second World War, mm-hmm. we were the good guys. We were spreading democracy. We were trying to create societies, both in Japan and Germany in particular, that looked far more like us. Mm-hmm. Does that then have a problem once you begin to move outside of that Western sphere?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, the culture we are in the West is not the same culture people are in Iran, in Iraq, in Africa, in Asia, Afghanistan, Latin America. Once we leave the Western, barriers, we are in completely different cultures. I mean, which is also called the dynamic of high context cultures versus low context cultures. In some cultures, people that speak between the line, you have to read between the line. They're not like direct, they're not overt as we are here. So we need to like interpret their manners. When I tell you this is good, I mean it, it's good. And we can agree on that. But they only need to roll their eyes for you to understand that it's not good. Think of it. When you are involved in negotiation with Iraqi officials, you're sitting down comfortably as a diplomat, and the sole of your shoes is like facing, the other party, the counterpart, the people you're negotiating with. In our culture, that's accepted. I'm sitting, crossing my legs, and the sole of my shoes is like facing, my counterpart. That's accepted. We do that all the time. But in a culture like Iraq, when you do such a thing, it's like an insult to the other party. They will not accept it. And that's alone can disrupt the negotiation process. And when in the Bush administration, when they happened, he traveled, he went to Iraq, and one of the journalists threw his shoes at him. I mean, in the news here, we did not understand the meaning of it. But in their culture, when somebody grabs their shoes and throw their shoes at you, it's like the greatest humiliation they could inflict upon you. Which is what that journalist did. I mean, he really, really insulted our president. Big in their culture. We did not understand that fully in our culture, in the news here. Our interpretations were like all over the place, except, the true meaning of it. So, to kind of, recap, whatever we do fits within the parameters of our cultures, the Western cultures. But when we go beyond the barriers of our culture, then, the meaning changes completely.
Let me ask you this on the other side of this thing, which is Iran. Given their own particular culture, do you think that they understand where the Americans are coming from and their cultural biases and prejudices? And for that matter, the Iranians have influence throughout the region, to say the least. Do they understand even the countries that they are involved with, particularly since you've got, for instance, obviously the conflicts between Shia and Sunni and so on and so forth? I mean, what is their shortcoming, as it were?
I think, it's a very interesting question, and it will be difficult for me to speak on behalf of the Iranian, that they understand or they do not. It all depends. Some people might understand if they really engage with our cultures. I mean, working with our people from our cultures, diplomats, and so on, and vice versa. But others will not understand. We can only understand other people's culture if we engage with them in a dialogue, which is why in my book I talk about, intercultural dialogue. We learn to understand one another when we engage, with one another in dialogues, bridging the cultures through dialogue. That's critical. So Iranians will understand where we're coming from only when they engage with us and when we engage with them, which is why I believe it's a very sad, in my opinion, position to not allowing the Iranian foreign minister to get a visa to come express himself before the UN. We have to make sure that we promote dialogue, regardless of our differences. We disagree, we are different. That's cultural, and we cannot eliminate that. We cannot eliminate our differences. We cannot destroy them. We have to find a way to engage with one another, though. That's critical for us to be safe. I would explain it within a family. We are family members and so, but we're still different. Dad is different from mom. Mom is different from dad. The kids are different in terms of culture. Maybe I'm shocking you, but it's a fact. It's a fact. I mean, don't think of it. The kind of culture your kids they navigate in daily, at school, the movie they watch, the book they read, and so on, it's not exactly the same culture that you are in daily. Even though your kids they have the same ancestry that you do, and so on, their culture will be different from your culture. The core, of course, will remain the same. The core cultural will remain the same. But the cultural connotations, the colors, the decorations that add to their culture affect their culture and the way they be. But you're still able to get along, to engage with one another, to talk to them, and they talk to you, they call you father, and so on. We need to find a way to bring that up on the international level. Our differences should not divide us to the point that we're not able to engage with one another. And I think it would be great that we can engage with Iran.
Let me ask you this, because there seems to be some disconnect between, on the one hand, the Iranian people who have gone and demonstrate, and as a matter of fact, I remember hearing a report where they would decry the United States, and then when somebody found out that someone was an American, they had plenty of questions, they liked them, and so on. There seems to be a disconnect between governmental policy, foreign policy, the theocracy, as it were, as opposed to the people below who may not like what the U.S. government is doing, but nonetheless like Americans. I mean, there seems to be a dichotomy here.
That's a great point. Indeed, the people, what their leaders are doing does not always reflect their values, their feeling, their positions. And I've been, around the globe. And it's amazing to see how people react when they see you coming from the U.S. They're really welcoming, including on the street of Tehran, in Baghdad. The same people who are heavily criticizing the policy of your government, who are against, whatever your government is doing, they welcome you. I was listening to NPR yesterday, and I was amazed, to hear that, one of the journalists of NPR was, in Tehran having a coffee with, an Iranian professor, and, everybody around her was excited, welcoming, warm, and so on. And the Iranian professor was telling her, if you live here and you tell everybody that you're from America, then they might try to see you from a different angle because they will remember all the policies of your government. But if, you stay beyond the arena of politics, they will really welcome you and so on. What does that mean? It means that whatever rhetoric, we're hearing in the news from our leaders does not always reflect the cultural realities of the countries that we think we are in war with. And that's where what I call multi-track diplomacy plays in. We have to find a way to engage the people in those countries at the grassroots level. For instance, reaching out to the students population at the University of Tehran, for instance, and finding a way to exchange students, between our country and their country. It will be a powerful way to start building peace from the bottom up, like we say in the language of conflict resolution and peace building.
In terms of Iran, do you think that the government and the way it controls the country, obviously there's been dissent. We've seen that just recently against the government in terms of policies and how the Iranians are living. But do you think that kind of popular sentiment can change a government like, say, Iran?
Well, pretty much, every government has their limitation. I mean, there's nothing like perfect regime, and so on. In my book, I praised democracy. Democracy is a very good political system, but democracy has its shortcoming. And we all are aware of it. And we don't need to say much about it before we understand what we mean. And then autocratic regime also, they have their shortcoming and so on. I mean, in a country like Iran, we see a regime that is very autocratic and oppressing people, repressing their own people, in some cases killing their own people and so on. But I think, advocating for a regime change, by force is not, in my opinion, the best approach. We have to find a way to do things diplomatically, and like I said, multi-track diplomacy is a very good approach. Having the people, mobilizing the people to express their will, to do, what they want to do, will end up bringing a change that comes from the bottom up.
One final question before I go to your book here, and that is that it seems to me that when people advocate for democracy, what really one should be advocating for is liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. I use that as to say not only obviously people go and they vote, but you also have to have checks, for instance, on the tyranny of the majority, which is obviously something that Madison talked about. And there was some great concern, as a matter of fact, by the founders in this country. Mm-hmm. Is the concept of liberal democracy something that you think will spread? You think that's a good idea? How do you promote that ideal, if indeed you agree with it?
Well, when you go to the root of democracy in Greece, you see that to some extent every type of democracy is liberal. It's liberal. I mean, they really want to make sure that the people participate in the government, they have their say and so on. But regardless of the type of democracy you're dealing with here, there will always be people who will be dissatisfied, which is where the checks and balance come in to help. And it's, in my opinion, a disaster when in a democratic system there is no checks and balance, or there is a tendency to suppress or negate the checks and balance system, which unfortunately is what is happening in many countries now around the world, which pretend to be democratic countries, but they are willing to suppress the checks and balance. The checks and balance are pretty much what makes democracy democratic.
Let me turn to your book, Mindful of Cultural Conflicts. And the first question for me was, why did you decide to use fiction and these various characters to illustrate all the kinds of ideas we've just been talking about?
Thank you. Fiction reflects the world. Fiction reflects people's stories. And storytelling is a powerful way to spread or reflect reality, the daily life. So that's the only reason why I resorted to fiction. Yeah.
So tell me then a little bit about the character. The first characters with the young woman and her family, which I guess is of Hispanic origin.
Well, pretty much, culture is not Hispanic per se, but it's Latin. The Latin culture. Anyway, yeah. The Latin, of course, Latin, gave birth to French, Spanish, Portuguese, and all the Romanic languages that we are aware of. So to some extent, I can give you the benefit of the doubt, that it reflects some Spanish. But in culture, I want to reflect many different cultures, from the Western world and beyond. And she is a character that, shows how culture can be tricky, challenging.
It seemed very, I guess, conservative in the traditional, American sense anyway.
Well, I won't say American, but conservative to some extent, because not all Americans are conservative. There are many Americans who are, right, who will not depict themselves as conservative. But you're right, it's conservative.
Right. In terms of the death penalty and abortion and those, particularly the various social issues.
Right. They're very, conservative on the social issue. Abortion, no. Mm-hmm. Death penalty, yes. And some other issue like gun and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you obviously have then her what becomes her boyfriend. Tell me about him and his family.
Ibu.
Much more different. Yeah, much more different in terms of where they come from.
Right. Ibu reflects a different culture, open-minded. They will welcome you even if you're not part of their circle, and they will integrate you and so on.
At one point, the she has a roommate, and they obviously have this dispute over keeping the apartment clean, right?
Right.
Her roommate likes to keep it clean. She's, on the other hand, has not done this because her mother took care of all this. But then Ibu comes along and instead of telling her to do something, he does something else. Tell me a little bit about that incident.
So pretty much, roommate conflicts are conflict that we encounter, a lot. So myself, I've been like roommates with so many people when I was a student, and we've been caught into those type of conflict all the time. Yeah, that's right. So pretty much, you'll have like instances, myself included, where I come home and the sink is like, full of dishes and stinking. And I would like call upon my roommate, hey, come on, let's, clean this. And the answer in some cases will be no. I said, no, that's not fair. And then I would like, demonize my roommate, judge him and say all the nasty thing about him. Later on, I will find out that no, it's not his fault. It's because of the culture he's coming from. That's a guy, a wonderful guy who grew up, in a household where mom was the one doing everything. Mom would like wash the dishes. Mom will make his bed for him. Mom will sweep his room, the floor, do everything. And he spent like his entire, youth without doing anything, without learning anything. And then, he in college, 17, 18, how do you expect him to be able to wash the dishes if he has not learned that at home? How do you expect him to clean the apartment if he has not learned that at home? Now, me coming from a culture where mom was like pushing me to do everything in the morning. You have to wash the dishes on your own. You have to like make sure that, you clean the bathroom. You have to make sure that you sweep the floor. You make your own bed. I mean, I grew up in that type of culture where I've learned, to do all those things. So I come to college, I'm able to do them because I've learned them. I mean, should I blame my roommate who did not get the chance to grow up in a culture like my culture? I can't blame them. How do I know? By engaging with him. By like calming down when I see the sink dirty, why are you not washing the dishes? Let's, talk about it. And then we have a dialogue around it. And in that process, I discover who he is, where he's coming from. And then we tolerate one another. We move on to helping one another. And, it will be like a completely different situation than me judging him. In a book somewhere I said that, actually, but being able to engage in a dialogue with your roommates, with your friend, heals them more than you condemning them. Like somebody said, compassion cures more than condemnation.
What do you think this story means for the people who are trying to negotiate these grand agreements and trying to get nations together?
We pretty much, it's an invitation for us to pay attention to people's culture. Every human being is a product of their culture, like I said. And every country reflects a series of culture. And those cultures are different from the cultures that we are in our country. We want to make sure that we pay attention to their culture and they pay attention to our culture. So when we are involved in international negotiation, let's be mindful to observe cultural dynamics and to pay attention to cultural dynamics.
Do you think the previous administration did that better than the current one?
Well, I don't want to get caught into a game that compare administrations. I think every administration has its strengths and its challenges, and the times are not the same. But it's a fact that being in a position of leadership is a very challenging thing, and we have to be mindful of everything we're doing. So my call here will be like being mindful.
So if you were to be in the seconds that we have left, if you were to give some advice to the Secretary of State or the President, what would you be telling them about how to approach these countries?
Being mindful of the culture that we are dealing with.
We were speaking with Dr. Jacques Koko. He's Associate Professor in the Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution Department at Salisbury University. Also has a new book called Mindful of Cultures and Conflicts. And we appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.